Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the historical context and the incredibly rich message behind one of the New Testament's most complex and, honestly, mysterious texts, the Epistle to the Hebrews. We're going to break this down into two main parts. First, the stage, the real-world crisis that actually prompted this writing, and second, the star, the ultimate message the author really wanted to get across. Let's get right into it. So we have to start with the greatest unsolved whodunit in all of biblical literature. Who actually wrote the book of Hebrews? Now, unlike the letters of Paul, which always kick off with a very clear greeting and name, Hebrews just drops in completely anonymously. There's literally no opening salutation, and the author never identifies themselves. And from the earliest centuries of the church, this missing signature has sparked a massive debate. While nobody has ever reached a universal consensus on this, scholars over the centuries have proposed some pretty fascinating prime suspects. For a long time, especially in the Eastern Church and championed by heavyweights like Augustine, Paul was the top candidate. But there's a catch. The writing style is vastly different from Paul's. So others have pointed to Luke, mostly because of the highly educated, polished Greek style. Martin Luther famously threw Apollos into the ring, since he was a learned Alexandrian uniquely skilled in rhetoric and the Old Testament. And get this, back in 1900, scholar Adolf von Harnack even hypothesized it could be Priscilla, arguing her name might have been deliberately lost or moved later on. But despite all of those really educated guesses, we ultimately land exactly where the 3rd century scholar Origen of Alexandria did. He concluded, who wrote the epistle? In truth, God knows, right? But here's the thing. The early church still widely recognized this text as having absolute divine apostolic authority. They realized that whether Paul, Luke, or somebody else entirely held the pen, the theology itself was profoundly apostolic and deeply inspired. They decided that true authority rested in its truth, not just a signature. Section 1. A Faith Under Fire. The context. To really understand the what of Hebrews, we need to shift gears for a second. We have to look past the unknown author and focus on the very real, very known crisis of its original audience. It's time to play literary detective and look at the timeline. The text actually mentions the release of Timothy from prison, which places it squarely in the latter half of the 1st century. But here's the crucial clue. The author talks about the Old Covenant animal sacrifices in the present tense. That means the temple in Jerusalem was still standing and actively operating. Because there is absolutely zero mention of the cataclysmic destruction of the temple that happened in AD 70, scholars strongly date the source material for this explainer to right around AD 68 or 69. So, who exactly was reading this back around AD 68? Well, the original readers were likely a diaspora house church of Jewish believers. They were Hellenistic, which just means Greek-speaking, Jews who had accepted Jesus as the Messiah. But things had gotten really bad. After AD 64, Emperor Nero launched a horrific empire-wide persecution of Christians. Just imagine being in their shoes, terrified, exhausted, totally marginalized. These believers were seriously contemplating abandoning Christ and just going back to the safety and legal protection of traditional Judaism. Essentially, they were on the brink of a massive spiritual stampede backward. Section 2. A Word of Exhortation. The Written Servant. The author tackles this impending crisis not with some standard, polite letter, but with what Hebrews 13:22 explicitly calls a word of exhortation. This wasn't casual correspondence, It was essentially a fiery, urgent sermon reduced to writing. Dr. Thomas Constable mapped out the author's masterful rhetorical strategy here, and the alternating structure is just brilliant. The author doesn't just deliver a dry, boring theological lecture. Instead, they alternate deep theological exposition right alongside urgent pastoral exhortations. So they'll build a massive theological case, like explaining the superior person of Christ, and then immediately hit you with a practical warning, like the absolute danger of neglecting salvation. It creates this rhythmic, powerful cadence designed specifically to shake the readers awake and fortify their wavering faith. Section 3. The Star. The Absolute Superiority of Christ. Now we get to the absolute core of the author's argument. It's a simple but insanely profound thesis aimed right at that terrified audience. Do not go back to Judaism, because Jesus is absolutely superior to everything that came before him. To make this point, they repeatedly hammer home one specific key word, better. It is literally the keynote of the entire text. These Jewish Christians were being taunted by their persecutors, told that they had lost their heritage. So the author goes to great lengths to prove that what they actually have in Christ is infinitely better. We're talking a better hope, a better covenant, better promises, and a better sacrifice. The really crucial point here is this stark contrast between the Old and New Covenants. The author argues that the old system, with its Levitical human priests and those endless repetitive animal sacrifices, was really just a temporary shadow. It was always pointing forward to something much greater. The New Covenant, that's the eternal substance. Jesus didn't just step up and offer another animal. He offered a once-for-all, perfect sacrifice that completely and irrevocably changed how humanity accesses God. But, okay, there was a major theological problem the author had to address here. Jesus was from the tribe of Judah, right? Not the priestly tribe of Levi. So to prove Christ's superiority as a priest to a very Jewish audience, the author does something brilliant. They reach way back into the Old Testament to this incredibly mysterious figure named Melchizedek. He's mentioned only super briefly in Genesis 14 and Psalm 110, but Melchizedek was both a king and a priest long before the Levitical law even existed. The author uses him as the perfect precedent to establish that Jesus belongs to a higher, older, and totally eternal priestly order that completely supersedes the line of Aaron. And it brings us to the ultimate portrait of Jesus in this text, our great high priest. Because Jesus is the perfect God-man, he intimately understands and actually sympathizes with our human weaknesses and temptations. The text explicitly shows him as superior to the angels, superior to Moses, the lawgiver, and superior to Joshua. And unlike the high priest of old, who had to constantly, repeatedly offer the blood of animals for their own sins and the sins of everyone else, Jesus offered his own sinless body as the ultimate atonement. He permanently removed the barrier between humanity and the divine. So why does all of this matter? Well, it matters not just for that frightened first-century reader, but for anyone looking at this text today. Because of Christ's perfect, completed work, the veil is torn. We literally don't have to shrink back in fear or rely on endless rituals anymore. Just like this beautiful verse from Hebrews 4:16 outlines, we're invited to draw near with absolute confidence to the throne of grace. It's a profound message of ultimate access, and honestly, immense comfort in times of trouble. As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to consider the ultimate, enduring challenge of Hebrews. The author was writing to a community that was right on the brink of turning back out of sheer fear. But he showed them that Christ is the final reality, the perfect sacrifice, and the ultimate, eternal high priest. So I'll leave you with the very same question that challenged those early believers. If Jesus has provided the final rest and absolute perfection, why would we ever trade the reality for a mere shadow?